Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. I'm probably going over just 5 tips and tricks to have in mind as you head into your draft this week or this year. Most of you guys are either drafting this weekend or the next, and I just wanted to give you guys some tips. I recently came out with a video going over some tips and tricks I employ in auction drafts. These tips are a little more applicable. They tie mostly back to snake drafts, but sort of go into hand in hand with auction drafts as well. But they're just things that in general I think are good to keep in mind during your draft. Things that'll help you just keep in the back of your mind as you're going through your draft and help you make sure that you are being optimal with all the decisions you're making and not making sure you're putting yourself in a bad spot. So really fun going over these. If you guys have any additional tips and tricks you want to give, I'm super excited to hear them. So please do drop them in the comments. That way we can all help each other out and just make sure we've got the best draft possible this year. I want to make sure that we all can get as many championships as possible this season. So yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys find these enjoyable. And yeah, we'll just get into the first tip here. So the first tip here for me is going to be just to have a plan. The way I would normally go about discussing this is just by saying that you should have some sort of plan in terms of how you want to build your roster regardless of how it starts. So obviously if you're picking, let's just use the 8 spot as an example, you really don't know before the draft whether or not you're looking to start the draft with a running back or a wide receiver, and you don't want to go into your draft only okay with the outcome of your roster. If you manage to get a wide receiver in round 1, you don't want to be stuck making a bad decision if you need to. You want to be able to be flexible based off of how things fall to you. So I personally make an effort just to build out some sort of roster, sort of going over general players that I can pick at each range and how I could build a team if I go hero RB, zero RB, if I take a top tier quarterback, if I take a top tier tight end, etc. Sort of all of those builds. I want to have some sort of idea of how I can build a roster, and then I'll generally rank those rosters, those builds in terms of how much I like them. And then for each one, I'll sort of have a bit of a list of which players I'm looking at and considering at each draft spot, because you can get a pretty good idea, especially for a snake draft, of what players you'll be looking at when it comes to your turn on the draft. Obviously, there will be some variation during the course of your draft, but in general, ADPs are pretty consistent over the course of the snake draft. You can generally look plus or minus 5 picks away from where you're drafting, and the same general guys will be available for you in almost whatever draft you're in. So it's pretty easy actually to be relatively prepared and planned out about how you want to go just approach different things that can come your way. And I think the biggest key here is just as well to make sure you've practiced beforehand, make sure you've done a bunch of mock drafts, make sure you've done and played around with all sorts of different builds. Now you're prepared with some sort of strategy for which way you can turn your draft based off of how things go as they flow along in your draft, and that way you'll be prepared for whatever falls to you, and that way you can sort of optimize based off of whatever happens there. Next tip and trick I'm going to give you guys is just to keep track of what the teams drafting around you are doing. This is especially applicable to teams that are drafting like near the turn. So if you've got like the 4th pick or the 9th pick or the 3rd or 10th or whatever, those teams specifically should really be keeping really good track of what the teams drafting around them are doing. It's a really common and easy mistake for people to make to not make note of that. Let's just say you're picking from the 10 spot, right? And the 11th and 12th teams already have their tight end or quarterback. Let's say you're in round 7, so you're picking right before teams 11 and 12. Teams 12 and 11 will then pick right after that, going into round 8. It's really easy to pick a quarterback there if they're the highest rated player on the board. You need a quarterback for your roster, and it's just a really easy auto pick to make if you're in that spot. But it's actually kind of silly to make that selection because very, very rarely will a team draft a backup quarterback, and you want to make note of which teams already have them so that you know whether or not you need to be worried about a quarterback going off the board or a tight end going off the board or even running backs and wide receivers. You can sort of keep track of, if this team's been going 0 RB and we're into round 7, you got a pretty good idea that they're going to be looking to target the running back position in round 7. Same thing if a team went really heavy at the running back position early on, you can sort of make a pretty good guess they're going to target receivers early or later on. So it just helps to keep track of what the team needs if all the teams are drafting around you, and that way you can sort of predict before it happens which players are going to go off the board in between your current selection and the ones after it. And it's going to really allow you to make the best selection there and make sure that you aren't just reaching on a player or taking a player earlier than you need to. Next tip I like to give you all is just to draft backwards a little bit. And I think that one of the best tiebreakers for me specifically when I'm in a snake draft, and I'm not sure which pick I want to make, especially if those are 2 players at different positions. Let's say you're at the end of round 3 or middle of round 3, for example. You're not sure if you want to take a guy like Devon Achane or a guy like Mike Evans, just for example. And you don't really know which of those players. You're pretty even in terms of which players you like there. Don't know which one of those guys is going to be your preference. The best thing to do there is just to take, in my opinion, is going to be to take a look at round 4, take a look at round 5, and see what players at those positions are going to be available to you there. Like I said earlier, in general, in snake draft, it's relatively predictable what players will be available each time you come up to pick. Obviously, there will be some variation based off of what league you're in. There will be some variation from ADP, but it's a pretty good guide in terms of what you're going to expect to see there. And what you can do is you can look at those picks in the later rounds and see maybe you don't like any of the running backs that are available in round 4 or 5, so you know you're going to look to target a wide receiver in those rounds. That would mean that maybe it's a good idea to take a running back in that earlier pick because you know you don't really want to take one later on, and you don't want to put yourself in a spot where you have that roster need and you don't want to you've put yourself in a spot where you feel like you need to take a position rather than a player that you actually like. So that's just an example. Of course, you also want to make note, when do you want to draft your quarterback? Maybe you really love those quarterbacks in rounds 6, 7, and 8. Maybe you want to get those Kyler, Jordan Love kind of tier guys. That way you can kind of know that you're not necessarily going to be looking to draft a running back or a receiver there. It sort of helps you build out your roster, make sure that you're planning ahead for the picks that you're going to make later, and that way you can educate the picks you're making earlier on before you actually make the selections later. Next tip I like to give is just to make sure that you have backup plans available for you at every single selection. I think a lot of us, including myself, when we're in a snake draft, we like to queue a couple players before each of our picks, just sort of star those guys and have them in the back of our mind, guys that we know we're going to be picking from when it comes our turn to make a selection. But this sort of falls all apart when you only select, let's say you pick 3 guys you're looking to draft for that pick, and there are 5 picks left before you get to pick. In all likelihood, those guys are going to be gone by the time it's your turn to pick, and if that happens with the last pick before you come up to pick, you're going to be really caught off guard. You're going to find yourself in a spot where you weren't ready to pick any of the players that are available, and all of us know that especially during a live draft, that clock timer, that pick timer moves really fast. You're going to easily find yourself in a spot where you're a little bit flustered. You're working really hard to try and get somebody on your roster that you don't hate, and it's better just to have guys queued, one more player queued than each pick between the current draft pick and then your next selection. That way, regardless of what happens, you're going to be ready with somebody in your queue that you want to draft. You're not going to find yourself in a spot where you're forced to make a panicked, scrambled decision that likely isn't going to reflect what you actually would have liked to do if you were a little bit more prepared. And the last tip I like to give here is just that ADP does actually matter. I think it's really important to take ADP into account, even if you do think it is wrong. And there are a lot of different ways to sort of keep this in mind. One thing to keep in mind is that whatever platform you're drafting on, the ADP is going to be wildly different than the consensus ADP across all the platforms. It's important to just take a look at your platform, make note of what the largest differences are between your platform and, say, the other major ones. It's good just to look at Fantasy Pros. You can sort of see what the ADPs are on ESPN, on Yahoo, on Sleeper, and that way you can just sort of see where your platform might necessarily be significantly different than the other platforms. And that's really going to allow you to take advantage of any discrepancies there and really get the most bang for your buck on that platform. But on top of that, I want to highlight that you do need to keep in mind that ADP is going to pretty strongly dictate just the order in which players get drafted on your platform, and it means that you don't necessarily need to always take the highest player ranked on your board. For example, say you're at the end of round 2 or near the end of round 2, your highest ranked player might be Josh Allen. Just for whatever reason, you're really high on Josh Allen, you want to take him in round 2, or you'd be willing to. He's your highest ranked player, but by ADP, you should be pretty comfortable knowing he's going to make it back to you in round 3. You don't need to reach on that guy just because you think he's the best selection. You want to make sure that you're getting him at value, and by letting yourself get him when he should come to you rather than reaching, it's going to put yourself in a position where you're getting more value in that earlier pick, and then you're still getting the guy that you want. So this is especially applicable to those of you guys that are drafting in the middle of the draft order. If you're drafting in the pick 4 through 8 range, you're going to find yourself in a spot where there's going to be, a few picks in between each selection you're making, but not so few or so many that you should probably just take the best player available. If you're drafting at the turn, if you're drafting at the 101 or the 112, there's going to be 23 picks or 22 picks in between each of your selections, so there you're going to be a little bit more aggressive. But when you're in the middle of that draft order, you just sort of need to make sure you keep ADP in mind, play that ADP game, and make sure you're not taking players earlier than you need to. So that'll do it for the tips and tricks I have to offer for you guys in snake drafts this season. Hopefully you guys found these useful and can use them in your drafts these next couple weeks, and really hoping you guys can have some really dominant drafts over the next couple weeks and have some really good seasons. Of course, if you guys do have any other comments or pro tips you guys want to offer to all of us, feel free to let us know in the comments. It's really fun to interact there and see if we can pull together some more tips there. So it should be a lot of fun there. On top of that, there will continue to be 4+ videos every single week throughout the course of the rest of the off season. So if you want to make sure, along with the regular season, so if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any of that, it'll be all free. All you got to do is be subscribed to the channel, and that way you can make sure you don't miss out on any of this. So beyond that, if you made it this far in the video, please do give the video a thumbs up. It really helps me out. And then, yeah, super excited, and I'll catch you at the next one. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If
If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.